What would you say are the key recommendations of your final report?
Well, I think our final report is this. This is a conversation which we think we've set a new tone with on sectarianism. And that means that dealing with it in a way which is serious but not sensational, not putting it into the cupboard and saying we're not going to talk about it, not dealing with it in a way which is just in the media. And at the same time, that means action. So the learning is key. How do we learn from what the groups that have been on the ground are actually doing? How do we bring evidence actually to bear here, because we have to do it on evidence? So we've encouraged the Scottish Government to support the development of a huge evidence base, which hopefully over time will develop something really quite important. Then most of the recommendations then are, how do we take this forward in public policy? So that looks like the government hopefully taking ongoing interest in this topic, so constantly bringing the issue to public attention. But then beyond that, most of the actions aren't really that high level. They're about trying to get local government to take this seriously. Let's get it mainstreamed into local government. In education, let's make sure that people can access this. In football clubs, can the question of how football clubs act really quite seriously now to tackle this. There is a idea which UEFA have called strict liability, which is that football clubs take direct action. So we're interested in that. We're also interested in encouraging people to experiment in the arts and so on, and do that, and in churches really taking this as part of how they do community work. So we've made a series of recommendations for particular people, for particular groups, which reflects what we think is important here. That sectarianism isn't just one thing, it's many different things in different places. And that if we can make it one of those issues which is one of an equalities issue which is actually showing progress, then that will be very important.
Why have you felt the need in the final report to adjust the definition?
Well, that was something we were always going to do. The first definition we put out was one which was very comprehensive, but we recognised was a bit wordy, and at the same time was something which we wanted to actually consult on. We wanted people to think about it and feed back to us. So people did, and some people of course said we have to have a working definition which is much more simple and much more tailored to our circumstances. So some people working in youth work, or some people working in sport, or some people working in churches wanted a particular one. But we also got feedback from a number of people, and we were doing our own reflections. So we simplified the definition, we tried to clarify, and we tried to make sure that maybe this time this can work as something which everybody can buy into, which suggests both that it has a core, but it also expands into many different places.
Now, on research, there is quite a significant emphasis in this final report on research. What have been the key findings from the research that you have, and where do you feel there are significant gaps?
Well, there's two types of research. There's quantitative research, which tries to get statistics onto the table, which looks at how are people's attitudes, or what are we seeing in terms of people's actual ability to access goods and services and so on. That's very important in establishing baselines for equality, and we think that's an important dimension. And the findings around that are that people are still concerned that sectarianism is a major issue. We found also from the equalities research that there's evidence that much of what people fear around discrimination is disappearing, or is hopefully on the way to disappearing, and that's something we can monitor both of those over coming years and hopefully see improvement. So we've created a baseline there. The second thing is qualitative research, which is trying to actually understand sectarianism isn't just in measures, it's actually in relationships. And we did a number of pieces of research, the most important of which were looking at marches and parades and how they impacted in community life. And we did one on sectarianism in communities, which talked about how this was still a factor affecting social relationships. And I think in both of those we tried to point as to, well, how do we deal with the conflicts that arise over parades, and how do we actually try to make those better? And I think that looks like trying to enter into better dialogue, trying to be serious about times when it causes difficulties, but also trying to recognise that people have the right to their own expression, and we want to encourage that as well. So all of that is important. And in communities saying, sometimes this leaves a very big legacy, and sometimes it's part of people's history and affects how they act. and how they experience institutions. And so it's very important that we look at that in different contexts. So we've said local government needs to take a lead here, because what's true in North Lanarkshire may not be true in Angus, what's true in the south of Scotland may not be true in the Western Isles, what's true in Glasgow may not be appropriate for rural communities. And so it's very important for us that this is something which is taken up where it can be properly acted on.
You talked about, in the report, about local government, police, prisons, a variety of organisations taking much clearer responsibility and action. Has that been lacking, do you think?
I think across Scotland there has been a sense that this is an issue which is difficult. It's an issue which raises contention, and I think that there's been two ways then it's been in the public domain, either as a sensation when something happens as an event, or as something which is mentioned and then put away because people want to say it's not important, or in public they even deny that it exists. And we wanted to say, actually, that has impacted on the way lots of groups and organisations have dealt with this, either by trying to deal with it in private, and that might be the case in some communities, or deal with it in a way which doesn't make embarrassment for the agency. We'd like to develop practice in this area, and in order to develop practice in this area, you have to name it. And by naming it, we're trying to say it's best dealt with at local level, where what sectarianism is actually can be defined and made real to people living in communities, and the benefits can actually be realised. So making clear responsibilities is about people moving from sensation or silence to stepping up to the plate, as it were.
Now, within some of your research that you have published, a big majority of people tie football to sectarianism. Have you been disappointed over the past few years at the action that has been taken by football associations and clubs?
I think the fact that so many people tie it to football is one of the reasons possibly why some football people feel that if they enter into this area, it'll be something which they end up taking full responsibility for. So the word disappointment is probably your word rather than mine. My word would be that I'd like to see a lot more proactivity going on in football. I think that, like a lot of people, they have tried to make it somebody else's problem. It's not about saying it's only about football. We've made that very clear on numerous occasions. But it is about saying, when you get figures that we are getting from the Attitude Survey, that unless football is seen to be very proactive in this area, there'll be a huge hole in anybody seeking to tackle sectarianism in Scotland. So we would like to see very much action from the football clubs. There is this idea, which is called strict liability, which actually comes from the European football associations and is on the table in relation to racism. And the question is, why can this not be applied in the context of sectarianism? And if not that, is there a way which is even more appropriate for Scottish football, which we could develop together? So that requires a conversation, and that requires people stopping being in denial and being engaged with people of goodwill trying to work their way forward on this issue.
Now, both you and the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, have talked a lot about community engagement and local projects and tackling this problem at local level. Where do you see the role of young people, of the younger generation, and the youth work sector in tackling this issue?
I have to say I think youth work has a huge role to play, because I think one of the words that was used early on, or phrases that was used to us early on, was this phrase, permissive environment. And that means a context in which it seems to be okay to be aggressive, okay to be, if you like, sectarian and actually directly derogatory to people, or even to act that out. And I think a lot of people reported to us that that was strongest in youth culture. And so, to be honest with you, one of the areas of change that would be most important to us to look at is what's okay in youth culture. Now, we know that these things can change over time. We know that, for example, on issues like homophobia, that has changed very radically in the last 10, 15 years. We'd like to see the same kind of change around sectarianism. And I think youth work, which gets alongside young people, it's not about wagging the finger. It's actually about engaging with what's going on for young people. It's about giving people doors through which they can go and exploring issues with people. It's precisely the kind of way that this becomes something which young people can then talk about what's behind it and work their own way through it. And I think if people do that themselves, then it's something which people don't feel they're forced to give up. It's something which actually is seen as part of moving on. And youth work for that purpose is probably ideally suited to intervene.
And this leads us on quite nicely to the issue of social media and the huge online platform that is used by all of us, including young people. What role, for example, do you think the national portal, Action on Sectarianism, should have in the coming months and years?
Well, there's always a number of roles. There's a good example role. So there's the role of actually providing positive models and different ways in which people can engage with this and acknowledging it. I think we're going to have to find creative ways also to deal with some of the more aggressive things, some of that by giving different messages, some of it by hopefully making it unacceptable at a different level. So you can't attack this in a single way. And everybody knows that social media is both a huge attraction for people, but it also becomes a venue within which people who want to be aggressive can actually use it, and it's rather uncontrolled, and people tend to maybe make more extreme something that they wouldn't say in that context. So we're looking at two things. First of all, we need to see the way in which sectarianism is let loose on the social media, and from our particular angle we need to do a bit of investigation about where and how that happens. And the second thing is, I think we work with people who work with young people or people who work with people who use social media a lot to devise appropriate responses, because a simply heavy-handed response is not going to work. So I think something which uses social media in a more creative way is much more likely to create opportunities for us than simply a top-down banning approach. Of course, there are certain circumstances in which the level of the aggression is simply so much that there has to be a limit, and that is a discussion which isn't just about sectarianism, that's about social media in general. So in that, our evidence will be part of a wider conversation, I suppose, on hate crime, but it'll also be a wider conversation on how we police that cyberspace.